Welcome back, my friends. This is part 2 in a series of videos on what the difference is between an evidence-based practice and a science. And what we learned in the first video in this series is that medicine in the 1970s started the change from being based on authority and whatever was handed down and often did not work to being based on evidence. And we had the development of the term EBM, evidence-based medicine. Around the same time, actually starting a little bit earlier in the 1960s, the social sciences went through a crisis. So medicine went through a crisis of realizing that it was not scientific at all, and what they needed to do was to become more scientific, and they realized that the word science is really not even the right word. Let's call it accurately what we're looking for, which is evidence. So they realize medicine is not a science, but it can be evidence-based. Let's make it evidence-based. That's better than, frankly, the nonsense that was going on up until then. So medicine went through a crisis and a change. I must say that they've, in some ways, done very well in making that transition. We'll also see some big problems with it. And around the same time, fields like education go through a crisis for different reasons. The education crisis is for a different reason from the medical crisis. The medical crisis is because they were not looking at the evidence. They just didn't bother being evidence-based, so they need to start. The problem with education, you might say, goes even deeper, is more fundamental, is that the tools that would be used for determining if school A does a better job of educating students than school B, or does school B do a better job, the tools for researching that were not adequate. They hadn't been implemented as extensively as they were in the 1960s when President Johnson in the United States decided to fund these huge research projects, and they found out that the research methodology was inadequate. So, I read this quote at the end of the first video in the series. Let me read it again. What Daniel Stufflebeam concluded in this book by Stufflebeam and Zhang. Stufflebeam is the, you might say, first author, and Zhang is the second author. What they state on page 7, very early in this very important book, the SIP evaluation model, they state, to quote, the evaluation technology available in the early 1960s was mainly limited to controlled, variable manipulating, randomized, comparative experiments. They were experiments. The word experiment has a specific meaning in research methodology. It means you're going to apply a therapy to one group, you will not apply it to another group, and you will see what the difference is. That's variable manipulating. So one of the classic examples of it, instead of the word therapy, we can use the word treatment. That's the more common term. So suppose you think vitamin C can help treat a cold. So you give vitamin C to some group of people, say it's 100 people. You do not give vitamin C to the other 100 people. That's called a control group. You see if the people who take the vitamin C overcome their cold faster than the other people. And you try to keep everything else the same. There's what we call a placebo effect. The very act of taking the pill may have a psychological effect. So you give a pill that's similar to the pill with the vitamin C, except there's actually no vitamin C in it. So it's controlled. You try to control all of the complexities. Like you try to make sure the people are, have similar diets, similar experiences, or if they don't, you adjust statistically for that. You try to figure out, does the vitamin C work? It's variable manipulating, randomized. Means you don't use clients of Dr. Smith. That's called selection bias. You try to somehow not have your selection process filter out certain people, even unconsciously. So you try to randomize it. Take all of the people who are, well, you could use clients of Dr. Smith, and then you randomize. You randomly select half to get the treatment and half not to get the treatment. But you have no control over who gets the treatment and who does not. And comparative experiments. So this outcomes-oriented, emphasis on the outcome, objectives-based approach to determining whether behavioral objectives were achieved. That's what people used in those days. And the conclusion on page 7 of this book, this is the dramatic conclusion. Experimental designs did not work in the dynamic world of war on poverty projects. So after they do all this research and they apply these experiments to students in one school and students in another school, or students in one class in a school and students in another class, they actually were not able to determine which methods worked better. So Daniel Stufflebeam's attempts to use the evaluation methods of the time failed. They failed because education's too complicated. You cannot control all the variables. It's just too fuzzy, too complicated to simplify down to that level. So he said, this is not working. Our experimental approach does not work. So he developed the CIP, C-I-P-P, method of evaluation. CIP stands for Context, Input, Process, Product. Other researchers developed other methods, and in bold, here's the conclusion. Rigorous statistical sampling and research methods now play a small role in program evaluation, and other methods are relied on more because they provide more helpful and useful information about what methods work best. So in the field of education, researchers are no longer relying on the same kinds of research methods that are used more often in the field of medicine. So in medicine, you can have what's called a double-blind experiment for certain kinds of issues. You can almost never do that in education. So you have to use less rigorous, more flexible kinds of research methods. There are still research methods that work very well. In fact, they work so well. Here's the good news that happened in education is that the CIP method of evaluation has been extremely successful. They are able to determine what methods work better. It's very often used by the military. It's used in education. It's used in many fields. Big businesses hire experts in methods like the CIP method and similar methods to determine, is our business structured the right way? Is our leadership, our management doing the best possible job? Is this form of education the best way to educate? Is our military training that we give to our soldiers and other military people the best? And it works very well. It's very effective. It's produced more efficient systems that more than paid for the cost of doing that analysis. So it is successful and it's being used widely. So we see how our understanding of how to figure out how things work. How do we figure out if medicine works? Well, number one, use research. Don't just use what was passed down based on authority. How do we find out what works in education? We need to use many kinds of research methods, and they have developed, evolved, and been refined and continue to be refined and improved over time. So the best research methods, the best way to find out what system of education works best requires a lot of different kinds of research methods, not all of which are as rigorous as an experimental design. Experimental design means you give a treatment to one group, don't give it to another group, and you see what the differences are. That's still used, there's still a place for it, but it's not the primary method. So, EBP, why does EBP develop? Why is it such a big deal? How is it different from science? EBP is not just a fancy, clever, fun word that means scientific. No. It was developed, number one, because the practice of medicine was not based on evidence. Medicine cannot reach the levels of accuracy that the sciences can, and the new emphasis became known as evidence-based medicine, that doctors, nurses, and other healthcare practitioners must use the best available evidence. Number two, the field of education tried to be scientific. They tried using scientific procedures called experimental designs, but they did not produce useful findings. After all the time and money was spent, they could not determine what school was giving a better education. Less rigorous research methods proved to be more helpful. Daniel Stufflebeam was an expert in experimental designs. He was a professor, a highly respected professor with expertise. He was one of many people who was a leader in this movement to change the way that approaches to education are evaluated from using only experimental designs to using a more flexible and varied approach to studying it, using more kinds of research designs. So this movement to EBP is extremely strong. I don't know if everybody watching this video is aware of this. EBP is proving to be successful in every field, in education, nursing, other medical fields and healthcare fields. It's working. Clients are getting better outcomes. EBP works. So out of the failures that were found and the limitations and the fact that medicine was not scientific at all, was not using research, that the research methods used in education did not work, out of all those problems, something good emerged. By good, we mean something that works. It helps us find out what the best methods in medicine are, what the best methods in education are, and the magic solution is EBP. Now, EBP is wonderful. It's fantastic. It's helping improve our educational systems, our medical systems, but it is not a cure-all. It's not perfect. It's not a panacea to solve all our problems. For example, to quote from this article in an academic journal, this is a journal, I think, published in 2021, so it's fairly recent. Just to quote this one statement, there is now abundant evidence that the involvement of pharmaceutical companies corrupts medical science. Period. Full stop. Abundant evidence that pharmaceutical companies corrupt medical science. A lot of us can sense this. It's not shocking to us. But careful research and analysis of what's happening and how the research is conducted shows that the pharmaceutical companies who are so involved in financing, promoting, and developing the research on what the best therapies are, they're corrupting medical science. They're corrupting it through prioritizing things that make them money and ignoring other kinds of approaches. So, evidence-based medicine, we can conclude reasonably, and what I personally think is wonderful. The idea of EBM is wonderful. The fact that we let the pharmaceutical companies corrupt medical science is ridiculous. It's a disaster. It should not be allowed. So the problem is not with the EBM philosophy. The problem is with not fully implementing the principles of EBM. The principles of EBM are that we find the best evidence. It's just common sense. What's the best evidence? And our understanding of research methodology is that biases in the motivations of the researchers do affect the results. Absolutely, they affect them. And they distort them. And having research funded by people who are there to gain a lot from the results distorts what can be found, and sometimes it's even conscious and malicious, as well as often unconscious. So you need to have a level playing field for the research. Obviously, this is known. So there are violations of the EBM principles in medicine today. Extreme violations. Okay, So what I'm sharing with you is how do we know what works in the 21st century? It's called epistemology in philosophy. How do we know what works? And what are the procedures? In science, we use mathematical modeling, we use careful observation. Those are the two big key things that are used in the sciences. That's how we find out what works in science. In other areas, such as medicine and psychology, we use the EBP approach. We don't use science because science is not applicable yet. We have not found things with the level of confidence that's achieved in areas like physics, so we use the best evidence available. And that might sound like a subtle distinction, but it's very different. The demands for physics and biology are different from the demands of an EBP. A science attempts to find extremely reliable rules, things that work with high confidence. An EBP does not. Not directly, only indirectly. An EBP just wants to know what the best evidence is. What is the best evidence? And it has rules for determining what the best evidence is. So with an EBP, you use whatever has the best evidence. Because in an EBP, we're dealing with situations we have to address. People are sick. People are ill. People need to be educated. We can't wait for scientific validation. We just use the best evidence available. Got it? If you're in an area like physics, there's no pressure to make the next discovery in physics. Life goes on. And physics has the ability to find rules that work with extreme accuracy. Also true in biology. So what happens in those sciences is things become laws or become theorems. They become standard knowledge by their ability to work repeatedly and accurately. Doesn't matter if there's cause and effect. In an EBP, it's very different. You're in an area where we have to do something. We have to do something when somebody has pneumonia. We can't just wait for science to make a discovery. So we use the best evidence available, and in an evidence-based practice, there are rules for what is better evidence. And sometimes those rules are broken. In medicine today, the rules are frequently broken. Why they allow these rules to be broken, I don't know. I don't know what's wrong with the professional organizations, but they're allowing the rules to be broken and corruption to happen through the pharmaceutical companies. They're not following the regulations of EBM as carefully as they could. Excuse me. So let's dig into this a little bit more. What exactly is an evidence-based practice? How is it different from science? So I've already started to discuss this, but just to review, in the sciences, extremely high confidence can be achieved on many things. Using science, rockets are sent into outer space, and they're directed with great precision, etc. In an EBP, extreme confidence is rarely achieved. That's the difference between a science and an EBP. The rules of the game of a science and the rules of the game of EBP are different, as I just explained. And let's repeat this because it's very important. In science, a discovery is usually declared when extremely high confidence in the result is obtained. The 5 sigma result is the gold standard. Have you heard this term? 5 sigma? It's a gold standard in the sciences like physics, astronomy, etc., which means that the probability of obtaining the results is far less than 1 in a million. So if astronomers are looking through their telescopes and they see something, and the probability of seeing that is less than 1 in a million, what we call 5 sigma, has to do with a normal distribution. And when you're at the tails of the distribution, there's 1 sigma, 2 sigma, you get out to 5 sigma. It's extremely rare. And then if you can repeat that observation at 5 sigma a few times, it's declared a discovery. So very often, even in physics, the rule that's found or the discovery is based on a probability. It's not always based on a logical proof, That's more often done in mathematics. It's done through an observation that's so clear and undeniable, we might say, that it's declared to be a clear observation. And if you fall short of that, then it becomes just a theory, a possibility. Now, this is amazing, even with these high standards that, would be like ridiculously almost impossible that something could be seen, say, through a telescope. Sometimes it happens. Sometimes scientists declare that a discovery is made and then later have to state it was not made after all. So even physics is not perfect. There's a wonderful video about this by Sabine Hossenfelder. Oh, I spelled her name wrong. It's H-O-S-S, Hossenfelder. I believe that's correct. Called Particle Physics Discoveries That Disappeared. So you can go to YouTube, enter particle physics discoveries that disappeared. You'll see the video. It's fun to watch. She talks about how a discovery is declared and then later it has to be admitted that it was not made after all. But on the whole, what's happening in physics is you're building this huge body of extremely well-supported ideas and observations and formulas. In EBP, which is different from sciences, there is not a threshold for discovery. So in science, there's a threshold for discovery. You have to have this, to say you discovered something, it has to be like at 5 sigma typically. But in an EBP, the fundamental rule is you just use the best evidence possible. And this is really important, even if the evidence is weak, you still use it if that weak evidence is better than no evidence. So maybe we don't know what to do when someone has pneumonia or whatever the health problem. We don't know. The research is not clear. You just use the best evidence. Even if the evidence is weak, we need to do something. We need to do something when someone has an illness. Just use the best evidence. Maybe the best evidence is just don't do anything. Just have them drink water and rest. Okay, that's the evidence. And in order to decide what the best evidence is, there has to be clear criteria for how to prioritize evidence in the profession. And the professional organizations such as the APA, the American Psychological Association, or any other professional organization, they set standards for how to prioritize evidence. So you have these rules for how to prioritize evidence, and then the practitioners have to apply those rules. So I hope you can see at this point in this second part in the series of videos what an EBP is. Evidence-based practice is not some popular term with vague meanings. It has a very clear meaning, very well defined, and very different from a science. So on the next slide is an explanation of EBM. I want to give you some quotes from reliable sources so that all of this is clear and not just something that I'm saying. So here's a quote from the AAFP.org on the nature of evidence-based medicine. On the next slide, I have a quote from an organization regarding evidence-based psychology. So in regards to medicine, many clinicians, even clinicians, note that, my friends, clinicians, doctors, nurses, other healthcare practitioners, they're sometimes not familiar with the foundations of what they're doing because they're practitioners. But even they mistakenly believe that applying some evidence is practicing EBM. Is EBM about applying some evidence? That depends, however. What counts is basing clinical decisions on the best available evidence, not just any evidence. So, that's common sense, but just to make this clear, an evidence-based practice means that you're using the best available evidence. So when I say, for example, that vibrational astrology is an evidence-based practice, it's not just because vibrational astrology uses evidence in a more rigorous way than other fields. That's not enough. It's not enough to call yourself an evidence-based practice. You must use the best available evidence. And that also means you have to prioritize what's more important evidence. And we have that. I'm going to show that to you in this series of videos on EBP versus science. It also does not mean that we are paralyzed when good evidence to guide us is not available. That's what I just said. People have pneumonia. They have problems. We're not paralyzed. We're not going to sit there and say, well, I don't have good evidence. EBM, here we have in bold again, EBM requires the daunting task of evaluating all relevant elements, something that clinicians in practice cannot be expected to do. That is why it is important to identify and use high-quality sources of pre-appraised evidence for which a team of experts has done the heavy lifting, sorting through hundreds or even thousands of studies to produce systematic reviews and meta-analyses that synthesize the available evidence. Research experts go in with criteria, and it can be painstaking, it can heavy lifting, it can be a lot of work to go through all of these different sources and conclude what the best evidence is. The researchers present those results to the practitioners, and they say, this is what we concluded from all of this, and then the practitioners are required and responsible to implement that evidence. That's how it works. So you, in a way, maybe you don't like evidence-based practice. It gives less freedom to the practitioner. They must adhere to the best evidence. And if they don't agree with the best evidence that the experts have presented, they need to make an argument for why it's not. And they cannot make that argument outside of the rules for what the priorities are for evidence. So an evidence-based practice does have rigorous and clear rules for what you can do and not do. So it has something in common with science. There are rules, there are regulations, there's a system. It's not like a chaos. It's not every person for themselves. It's not an anarchy. But it's different from science in that typically we don't really know if that best evidence is giving the best result. It's just the best we have. The idea is, let's use the best evidence we have. Now, in psychology, extremely similar to what we have in medicine. All the evidence-based practices are similar. So, reading from this slide, the APA is the American Psychological Association. The APA Council of Representatives adopted a policy statement of evidence-based practice in psychology at their August 2005 meeting. 2005, that's not that long ago. I'm making this video in 2022. 17 years ago, the APA comes up with a new, fresh statement about evidence-based practice. So EBP started in the 60s and 70s, started getting going in the 1980s. It feels like medicine and education. It continues to grow and develop, and the results are positive. It's the patient results, the client results are improving with the use of EBPs, and it's still being implemented in many fields. And even today, in 2022, you'll see new regulations adopted and implemented in different fields. This is an ongoing development, and it continues to grow and will continue to grow in the future. More and more professions are adopting EBP. So to quote from this conclusion from the Council of Representatives for the APA, evidence-based practice in psychology, they call it EBPP, evidence-based practice in psychology, is the integration of the best available research with clinical expertise in the context of patient characteristics, culture, and preferences. This definition of EBPP closely parallels the definition of evidence-based practice adopted by the Institute of Medicine. Now, this is important. In an EBP, there is a hierarchy of research from the most important and reliable evidence to the least reliable. And the clinical practice is important. If the researchers go through all of these studies and they find out that a certain therapy is the best one, But then the psychologists or the doctors or the nurses or whatever field you're talking about implement those with their clients and they're not getting great results, we have a problem. We have a problem. And also what you find when you apply the research is you need to adapt it to your specific situation with the kinds of clients that you have. And take into account the client preferences. You're not a machine just dispensing a therapy. You need to listen and adapt to your client. It's very well done. This is good. This is good. So it's a whole integrated system of knowledge from the most reliable, research-oriented information, what that evidence is, all the way down to the application with the client and what happens. And it should all reinforce each other, because if the research is accurate, if it's coming up with good results, then the doctors, the nurses, the chiropractors, the physical therapists, the psychologists, the astrologers, we can have an evidence-based astrology, EBA, evidence-based astrology, and we do. It's already established in vibrational astrology. If the things we find from our research are not working with you as a practitioner, we have problems and we have to fix them. They all must reinforce and build upon each other. So this is why we're spending this time understanding EBP, understanding what science is, and understanding how these things work, because they're vitally important for understanding how an EBA how EBA, evidence-based astrology, operates with the same concepts, the same ideas, the same principles used in EBM and in EBPP and any other evidence-based practice. I think this is exciting because these developments in, we can call it epistemology, how we understand what works in recent times, from the experiences people had in understanding what's going on in these different fields, has led to a common sense effective system that works well. And this is what we use in vibrational astrology and evidence-based astrology, and it works beautifully. And fortunately, we are finding that the things we discover from the highest levels of research that give us the greatest evidence, when they're used with your clients, wow, not only does it agree, but it reinforces tremendously our confidence in our models, because the consultations work so much better using the information we discover from the research. Okay, I think this might be, let me do these last two videos and then we'll go on to the third level. So in psychology, a sizable body of evidence drawn from a variety of research designs and methodologies attests to the effectiveness of the psychological processes. A sizable body from a variety of research designs. Very important, not just one little study. It's the building of a body of knowledge. Generally, evidence derived from clinically relevant research on psychological practices should be based on systematic reviews, reasonable effect sizes, statistical and clinical significance, and a body of supporting evidence. We'll talk about the word effect size later. Very important. The basic idea here is you want a body of research using different methods, agreeing and finding good results. That's all this is saying. Some of it's in a little more technical language, and that technical language is important so we know what a good result is. A good result, we have a term called effect size. It tells us how good a result is. We'll talk more about that. The validity of conclusions from research on interventions is based on a general progression. Okay, here is the hierarchy. Clinical observation through systematic reviews of randomized clinical trials, while also recognizing gaps and limitations in the existing literature and its applicability to the specific case in hand. This is just saying we need to look at the research and notice what the weaknesses in the research are. Psychological services are most effective when responsive to the patient's specific problems, strengths, personality, socio-cultural context, and preferences. That's from the APA.org. I give the website. Just reinforcing that point, that in an EBP, you are not mechanically taking what was found by the researchers, analyzing some database or whatever those researchers did. You're not just going to mechanically use it without critically evaluating how well it works. You're going to apply it based on the context and see what's different about what happened in the research, what's happening with your clients, and take into account the sociocultural context and the preferences of your client. You're going to use that data, but you're going to adapt it to your circumstances. And if you're finding that that data that came from the research is not working at all, even with adapting it, then that sends a signal back to the researchers that something's not working. So, and what we're finding in evidence-based astrology, in vibrational astrology, is the stuff we learn from the controlled studies. We apply that in our consultations, and over 90% of the time, nothing's 100%. Sometimes our applications go back and they change our way of thinking, but almost always we get this reinforcing lineage of information from the research to the application, and then the application in turn produces additional information that goes back to the researchers to improve the research models. It's all working very beautifully. What is the best evidence? Again, the goal in evidence-based astrology, evidence-based psychology, evidence-based medicine, any evidence-based practice is not that you're so completely convinced, not that the evidence is so compelling that you're so sure. It's just it's the best we know. Let me give you an example. I talk about this later, but let me give you an example before we end this second video in this series. We often say, I'm making this while we're at the end, hopefully the end, who knows, of this long COVID pandemic, people often say, take the vaccine, follow the science. Is that the best term? Well, medicine is not a science. We're following the best evidence, right? That might sound like a subtle issue of terminology, but it's not so subtle because we don't have a science of medicine. We have evidence-based medicine. What is the best evidence? And as soon as you say that, it takes some of the authority out of it and has us go back to understand what these levels of evidence are, to look at them, to see if pharmaceutical companies might be distorting what's going on or not. We have to look into all of that according to the principles of an evidence-based practice to find out what the best evidence really is. Okay. I hope that makes sense. And by the way, I'm not making some subtle argument, for or against, there's no hidden agenda here. I'm talking about what an evidence-based practice is, what it means, and how it is done. That's all. Okay, let's continue with part 3 on the nature of evidence-based practice versus medicine, and we will start getting into the details of evidence-based astrology, probably in the next video. Thank you very much for listening, my friends. God bless. Namaste.